the Academia 2063 Climate Policy Dialogue Series. My name is Layibu Take, and I'm the Director of Communication and Outreach for Academia 2063. We are so excited to have you here for the first edition of what will be a three-part series where we will be exploring African policy priorities for mitigation and adaptation pathways from Paris to Sharm el-Sheikh. That's right, we are adding our voice to climate action global conversations as we gear up for COP27. Today, we'll be hearing from a lineup of high-level experts who will discuss the theme food systems and climate change, assessing readiness and policy lessons in global negotiations. And I can promise you nothing short of a rich and exciting conversation. Please feel free to go to the chat box and tell us your name, your organization, where you're joining us from. I would like to let you know that we are offering simultaneous interpretation for this session. If you need that function, please click on the icon on your screen. As always, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will be directing them to the moderator. That said, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to welcome the moderator of today's session. He is a visiting researcher at Imperial College London and equally a member of the Malabo Montpellier panel. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Debisi Araba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Butake. Hello, everyone. Greetings from wherever you are joining us. As you have heard from the housekeeping rules, we encourage you to carry on with the engagement and use the question function to put in your questions and comments in the chat. We encourage you to put your thoughts down there and engage in this really critical conversation. I would like to now introduce all our speakers for today's session. I begin with Dr. Ousmane Badiane, the Executive Chairperson of Academia 2063. And next we have Dr. Harsin Yambe, Director of Sustainable. Oh, that's my apologies. Next we have Dr. John Asafu Ajayi, Senior Fellow and Head of Research, Africa Center for Economic Transformation, ACET. Next we have Ms. Bibi Giose, Special Advisor on Nutrition and Food Systems, Office of the CEO, the AU Development Agency, Auda NEPAD. Then we have Mr. Faustin Vuningoma, Coordinator, Rwanda Climate Change and Development Network. Next, we have Dr. Shilidzi Madzi Vandila, the CEO and Head of Mission, Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, FANRAPAN. And then we have Mr. Alex Mulisa, the Fund Coordinator, National Fund for Environment and Climate Change for NERWA. Speakers, I welcome you to this critical session. For the next stage, I would like to invite my dear friend, Dr. Ousmane Badiane, the Executive Chairperson, Academia 2063, to provide the welcome remarks. Dr. Badiane.
Thank you very much, Dr. Araba. Oga, my friend Debisi, for making time for us today and for joining us to moderate this session. Let me also welcome the other members of the panel who are joining us here, from Bibi to Chidi to Alex Mulisa and others. So thank you for making your time to join the session here today. We'll talk about something really, really important, climate change, climate negotiations, climate finance, perhaps more important in Africa than in any other part of the world, in terms of vulnerability and readiness and exposure. Africa figures among the most touched and threatened continent. Yet climate change, although an old phenomenon, is a new concept in the way we do business. It's a new challenge in terms of figuring out how to respond to it, how to adapt, how to minimize the costs. We're going through it every day, whether we are aware of it directly or not. So how we position ourselves, not just in grappling with the challenges coming from climate change, but how we position ourselves to find the solutions that will help us minimize the cost to our society and our environment, how we position ourselves to negotiate with the global community for climate, quote unquote, justice, how we can find ways forward that will find some convergence between our needs to continue to grow, the resources we need to continue to grow by minimizing our footprint in terms of emissions and environmental footprint. Those are complex issues that require expertise and resources and focus and long-term commitment. So the discussion here today is just one of those many things that are going on where we want to sharpen our understanding of these challenges, but also be much more focused in how we chart a course to deal with this, and as we interact with the global community to be not just a contributor to the solution in general, but also to know how to articulate and defend African positions and interest in that, while advancing the common goal of the global community as a whole. So it is really a pleasure for me to welcome you to this session today, and an honor to share the panel with the distinguished guests today, and thank them all for their generosity in terms of giving us their time. And this is now the time to say good luck to everyone, and then turn back to our distinguished moderator, my friend and colleague, Dr. Debisi Araba. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much, Oga, Dr. Badian, for those wise words with the opening remarks. I will now like to invite to deliver the opening keynote, Alex Molisa, the Fund Coordinator, National Fund for Environment and Climate Change. Alex is the coordinator. He has been at the forefront of the sustainable development process in Rwanda, overseeing the integration of environment and climate change across multiple sectors of the economy, and more recently, the green growth initiatives in policy and implementation. Under his leadership, his organization has financed projects and programs delivering on the ecosystem and natural resources management, innovative financing of renewable energy, commissioned studies on green city concepts, as well as mainstreaming green and climate resilience in local government planning and implementation. He has taken advantage of using his role to support national policy environment and the development of reliable governance structures. He has helped to mobilize over $90 million in 4 years of fund operations and funded 32 projects currently under implementation. Alex has a Master's of Science in Analytical Environmental Chemistry from Middle Tennessee State University in the United States of America, and a Bachelor of Science, a degree in Chemistry and Environmental Science from the University of Western Ontario, Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Alex Molisa. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Debisi. Glad to be here. Just to underscore the importance of being here, it's only yesterday that I had the pleasure to meet Dr. Osman and his colleague, Joseph, who we have worked with for quite some time. And that's how I end up here. It's just a meeting from yesterday. So I guess that meeting was very productive. To the point, we are talking of climate policy dialogue and on food systems and climate change. Quite frankly, it couldn't have been more timely for two reasons. One, because of the crisis we face with climate change and the increasing crisis of food security. So a nexus between the two aspects is very critical for this audience. And I am glad that we are here talking about it, which is why I jumped on the bandwagon when I was told yesterday to be part of this. So glad to be here. And thank you, Dr. Debisi, for your generous description. Climate change has a negative impact, not only on agriculture, which is usually affiliated with the food systems, but across a range of sectors, including energy, social protection, integrated water resources, name it. So it is that vital when we are talking of the policy implications of climate change, especially in relation to food systems. Food systems deal with the food supply chain. The value chain ranges from production. So how do we produce agricultural products, animal resources? How do we store them? How do we process them to add value to them? How do we distribute them from where they exist in abundance to where they exist in scarcity, which is at the heart of food security and addressing it? Then how do we actually consume them and deal with whatever is not eaten or consumed? That is the whole chain, and I submit that it touches every aspect of life as we know it. Therefore, when we are looking at the impact of climate change, both from a mitigation as well as an adaptation standpoint, it's really important to consider the cross-sectoral nature of food systems. And therefore, even when we are talking of policy implications, how do we actually integrate policies that are geared to introduce mitigation and adaptation across all sectors if we are going to impact society in terms of ensuring food security? There is significant evidence that despite those who deny the existence, the occurrence of climate change, and there are many here, that climate change is here and affecting us, and in a very direct way. There is a study that was conducted by Africans. It was published in the Journal of Waste Resources and Ocean Science. This was in 2019. And I chose that study because it highlighted and stated the implications of the increased rainfall and the temperature to the supply chain. This is further emphasized by the IPCC, which also was published in 2019. That is the sixth report, which stated that the 25% of GHG, that is greenhouse gas emissions, associated with the food systems. 70% of all freshwater use is also associated with the food systems, and 50% of the habitable land is similarly a result of food systems. So with this, with the importance of this, it further even talks about 14% increase in meat consumption by 2029 is going to be affiliated, to contribute to GHG emissions. Therefore, this calls to action, the kind of action we are looking for in Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27. So again, this underscores the relevance and the pertinence of this issue as we talk about it here. And I hope we are going to get out of this meeting something that we can transition from this discussion to Sharm el-Sheikh, talking about what Dr. Osman emphasized. Action is at the heart of this discussion. So in terms of readiness, we are assessing readiness and policy lessons in global negotiations. When we head to Sharm el-Sheikh, it's about COP27 negotiations. One of the most frustrating things is that there has been negotiations for the last 25 years, for the last 26 years, to say, because this is COP27. And in those, the far cry is about lack of action. So what happened and what makes this COP27 any different? I submit that one is the fact that this is an African COP, which is not very common. The last one was in Morocco. The previous one was in Durban in the COP17. We are in COP27. That is 10 years ago. So we better brace up, and I'm glad that this discussion is happening to see what we take there. So how do we become ready for COP27, but even beyond? It's not about attending a session in COP27. It's about what we get out, and we better be prepared, not only for the COP itself, but for what we get out. Now, when it comes to the food systems we are talking about, this is the first time a pavilion is going to be dedicated to food systems, and it is going to be called Food for Climate Pavilion at the COP27 in Egypt. This is something we are looking forward to because it again emphasizes the nexus of climate change and the food systems in its entirety, the value chain we talked about, which inevitably has to deal with how do we build the resilience across the different sectors that have impact on food production and distribution and therefore consumption. To add a voice to that, we have here in Rwanda where I sit, and I suppose a number of people sit, at least I know Dr. Augustine sits here. There has been a meeting this very September, of the Green Revolution, of the Africa Green Revolution Forum. There were a number of resolutions that they intended to take forward. But one critical one, even when I'm not tempted to talk about finance, is the fact that it committed to mobilize investment of 200 billion per year for adaptive food systems across Africa. And I deliberately want this to sink in. The question is, how do we do this? There are a number of ways that it has been done in the past, but it has not worked, which is why I talked about a far cry to the pledges that were made in the previous conference of parties. In order to do this, in order to mobilize this, we've got to be ready. And this starts all the way from how do we fashion our policies to implementation, and then to monitoring and evaluation, to know that something has come out of the previous investments, and then the wheel turns again to more readiness, catalyzing the commitments of finance to do climate action across different sectors if we are going to really address food insecurity that is associated with the food systems as we have already described. So when we are talking of policy options, there are specific policy options which have central themes as shift from monocultures to more climate resilient agrobiodiverse agricultural systems, promoting climate resilience, indigenous and local crops and varieties, shifting consumption patterns towards climate resilient diets. And then we all know that African agricultural systems are replete with the informal markets and subsistence agrosystems. So we've got the central theme of the role of informal markets in diverse and resilient food systems is very critical if we are going to make a difference for the African in terms of food security. To date, when we talk about even these policy options, even the readiness we are talking about, in the context of global negotiations, we cannot ignore the pressures that abound. And some of those pressures have actually popped their heads even in the lead up to COP27. Just recently, There is an organization, I believe it is a philanthropy, called 2050 Platform. It's based in Paris. It's been running for 5 years. They came around in Kigali talking about long-term strategy, climate strategy. So in the negotiations, a number of things have come up. For countries that want to look for external resources to support their domestic resources to move in terms of addressing climate change, they've got to put long-term strategies beyond what we are talking about, the nationally determined contributions and the national adaptation plans. Whereas those have for some time, since 2015, the Paris Agreement, been the main platform for resource mobilization, and suffice it to say that Rwanda in 2020 updated its nationally determined contribution to make it as ambitious as possible to avoid the pitfalls of these developed countries, but also in a bid to be able to attract what we call the conditional financing that is the mainstay of, at least in the top of the Paris Agreement. Yet, as much as this month, we are talking of going to the drawing board and coming up with long-term strategies. What are we talking about? So this is something that the African countries, as well as LDC in general, need to really be able to understand when we are talking of readiness. Yes, in Rwanda, we have the long-term strategy. It's called the Green Growth Climate Resilience Strategy, and it is aligned with our Vision 2050. Therefore, it's intended to deliver on 2050, which is exactly what this name 2050 platform suggests. So when we are talking of readiness, we've got to be conscious of our various strategies, long-term visions that then inform our medium-term strategic planning and therefore lead to implementation, and the whole cycle goes on. That's not all. When we are talking of readiness, do we have the technologies to actually cut across the value chain of food systems with a view to integrating mitigation and adaptation priorities that the country has? We also know that there is serious negotiations around the technology transfer and the technology sharing. So in terms of readiness, we've got to be able to think of what technology is appropriate for Africa, for Africans to share amongst themselves before we even begin to look for sophisticated technology transfers. That is something about readiness on the technology front. We talk about capacity building. It has become a slogan. My always joke is we have been since independence, some countries have been more than 50 years. We are still in the mode of capacity building. People on this panel, when are we going to be capacitated to drive our own development agenda? When we are talking of readiness, I think it is incumbent upon this group to even be able to think of how do we make our capacity building strategies much more African, in the sense that we can share and grow together if we are going to earn a place on the table in these global negotiations, the likes of COP27. These are some of the lessons we have learned, even about global negotiations, and they have implications and linkages with the policy. And the recommendations that I come up with: adopt policies on mitigation and adaptation options along different food value chains that cut across. We have to be deliberate. If we are talking of storage, if we are talking of distribution, we cannot avoid energy, we cannot avoid the transport. So let's be able to see how do we come up with integrated policies that we make good on, because a lot of times we have good policies, but implementation, again, is seriously wanting. Africa's readiness as a negotiating bloc will depend on Africa's support machinery. I think this is something I cannot emphasize enough. We have to depend on our regional institutions, the Africa Union. We've been talking of the Africa Free Trade. We've got to trade with ourselves before we depend on the likes of Ukraine, where when they have their wars, we cannot afford to live because prices have skyrocketed. And of course, all this has climate implications because in the first instance, we have to transport all these goods and the services from across the oceans to bring them to the shores of Africa before we even distribute them amongst ourselves. What does this require? It requires the role of the private sector. I cannot overemphasize this. A lot of times, these negotiations have been the platforms for public businesses. What we need is the Africa private sector to come on board and capitalize on the opportunities. There is money to be made in this business, and it's a high time, if we are talking of trading amongst Africans, that this area is not left behind. And last but not least, there is academia or research that is applied that is able to even carry forward the technology that is appropriate for us. So the road ahead it has significant opportunities, I can tell you, but it also has specific and remarkable challenges for us. And as we undertake discussions on this platform, I urge you to look at the nuanced way in which we can also Africanize adaptation and mitigation. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you on this platform.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, Alex, thank you very much for those inspiring words. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard it from Alex. At this point, I would like to have us transition into a panel discussion to go into the details of what exactly it will take to influence policies on mitigation and adaptation for Africa as we get ready for the COP27 meetings in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Ms. Bibi Gyose, I want to start with you, if you don't mind. Are you online?
Okay, I'm unmuted and you shall see my face.
Wonderful. Bibi, now you're a special advisor on nutrition and health or nutrition and food systems to the CEO of the African Union Development Agency. How are we seeing this nexus between health and climate change? Is it being put at the center? I was at an event on the margins of the UN General Assembly yesterday, and it was proposed to us that we should make climate change a human health crisis. That perhaps it's because we're not posing it as a human health crisis. This is why it keeps going to the back burner. We're currently now experiencing second, third order impacts of climate change, not just in Africa, but on other continents around the world. Nobody who has access to social media or who lives and breathes has not been impacted in one way or another, directly or indirectly, by climate change. And so what is it going to take for African countries to strengthen their hand on the negotiations going into Sharm el-Sheikh? But also, what do we need to know about health? What health implications or health data, health information needs to strengthen their hand as we wrap up the COP negotiations in Egypt? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Araba. First, let me acknowledge and recognize the fact that I happen to be the only lady on this panel. Although I may not have the data or the statistics, arguably, women and children may be disproportionately affected by climate change in the context of food systems, in the context of health, and in the context of nutrition. When you look at Africa as a continent, we happen to be the continent that happens to have one of the highest levels of all forms of malnutrition. Why is it that we find ourselves at this point? First, because our policies are not coherent. Sectors are not talking to one another. So somebody sitting in the climate section, somebody sitting in agriculture, somebody sitting in the private sector are not really understanding what really is ailing the continent from the perspective of the impact of climate change on the health and on human development more broadly. The fact of the matter is that women don't find themselves at the negotiating table. But I always say, if you are not invited to the dialogues, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring your own chair and find space and get into those dialogues and bring to the fore what the challenges are. And then, most importantly, thereafter, make sure you communicate the messages to the right people at the right time for the right impact. Now, coming to what can be done differently. Yes, we've had a lot of talks, discussions, declarations, and Africa does not lack all those declarations and commitments. But the thing is, as the previous speaker said, we are not implementing enough and effectively for impact. Now, out of the United Nations Food System Summit, Africa came up with a common position that does include and involve climate change, smart agriculture, and agroecologically suited products, be they aquatic, be they from the land, or be they from the wild. Why are we not taking advantage of our own resources and amplify our biodiversity so that we don't lose it as fast as we are seeing it disappear? And then, in addition to that, out of the Food System Summit, now Africa has declared this year to be the African Year of Nutrition. Why is this important? This is out of the recognition that if we are not going to be having a nutritionally well-off citizenry, Africa will not develop in the way that we want it. I've never seen any country that has developed on the backs of a malnourished population. So let's look at raising children with strong brains and strong physiques, and let's ensure we support the mothers because they are the bearers and the caretakers of children and the entire family. Now, we have had also, in the context of the the Committee on World Food Security, we have the voluntary guidelines. These guidelines are actually really beautiful in the sense that they emphasize in some of its chapters the importance of a multi-sectoral approaches and also the importance of food sovereignty. We should be cultivating and not relying on external crops that are not well suited to our agroecological zones. So this is very important. And coming back to the continent, we do have instruments. The Africa Regional Nutrition Strategy, the AUDA NEPAD implementation plan for food systems and nutrition. These instruments are wanting to bring together all the sectors such that all policies are coherent and policies speak to one another. Why is this important? If we are going to move a needle on the climate impacts, move a needle on malnutrition, move a needle on health, we have to make sure that the capacities are there, the understanding is there, and we really engage in a way that is productive, that is effective, and that can bear results for us. Over.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gyose. Just a follow-up question on that. In this year of African nutrition, going into COP27 and even going beyond, what is AUDA NEPAD doing, or how can they help African countries and other, whether national governments or other partners and stakeholders, to marshal ideas on bridging this divide, as you've mentioned, these siloed thinking between the climatologists, the people working in agriculture and food systems, and those working in nutrition and health, because these things are all tied together. Last year we had the Food System Summit, but then we want to see perhaps what maybe you share with us, what is AUDA NEPAD's thinking around how you bring these siloed thinking together, not just for COP27, but beyond? Are there any new mechanisms you're proposing, or are you looking to strengthen any existing mechanisms for partners across the continent? Over to you.
Well, absolutely. Thank you for that. That's a very pertinent question. What AKADEMIYA has been doing together with our partners such as the FAO and other UN agencies was to set up a Pan-African Parliament on food systems, food security, and nutrition. So we are wanting to ramp up policy transformation and indeed advocacy so that our parliamentarians understand, because they are the custodians of the legal systems and the legal instruments. So we want them to be able to understand and be our champions and messengers out there. Secondly, what we are doing is to look at what policies are existent in all countries and see if there are any gaps that need to be addressed today, tomorrow, and immediately even, so that, you know, no one sector policy is left without really being in a better position to know what to deliver, who to deliver it to, and with how much it will cost. Because let's face it, we may have, you know, what it takes in terms of our natural resources, but if we don't have the financial injection and the capacities to implement, we will not be able to get there. So we are building capacity across the different sectors, and we are even involving the youth so that the youth understand their role in moving forward and engaging in nutrition, food systems for development. We also have some research engagements, you know, in terms of understanding what really are the costs of not investing in nutrition. The cost of hunger studies in Africa pointed to us that Africa is losing anywhere between 2.5 to 16.5% of annual GDP. That's money we cannot afford to lose over something that is so preventable. The World Bank has shown us that if we invest $1 towards nutrition, you stand to gain anything more than 16%. So we really can do better, should do better, and the time to act is now. So let's take advantage of this year for nutrition and really apply our intelligence fully to what we can do better and do different.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kiyose. We look forward to the groundbreaking work that the new leadership at AKADEMIYA will be bringing to our mission to transform African economies and to ensure that we build resilience to climate change. Now, I think at this point, I want to do a bit of a segue and focus on what was one other aspect that was mentioned in the keynote address. Now, Dr. Ajayi, the IPCC released its second report earlier this year, and in there, it was really sobering reading on the impact of climate change. And we know that right now these are no longer projections. We're already feeling the impact, and we're seeing the impact. Yeah. Whichever part of the world you're in, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, regardless of the agroclimatic zone you live in, everyone is feeling the impact. And we're also starting to see the secondary impacts on logistics, supply chains, quality of life, etc. What is it that slows down action between the science? As a scientist who's been, at the vanguard of preaching from the rooftops that we need to change our ways, and not seeing commensurate action all the way from local, regional, global levels. What do you see as, first of all, your thoughts on the IPCC report, but also what's the implication on why we're not getting that commensurate action from leadership in public, private sector, etc.? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Debisi, and my greetings to everybody. And I'm really pleased to contribute to this conversation. Let me start off by saying that, just to preface my remarks, that although Africa has contributed only 3.8% of total global emissions, it has borne the brunt of climate change. And the latest IPCC report, which is the 6th assessment report, released in February 2022, it's not pleasant reading. It projects dire consequences for Africa. So just quickly, I'll highlight some of the key issues for Africa, and then go to the policy aspect. So across the continent, all regions are expected to experience warming greater than 3 degrees centigrade. So we are far past the 1.5 or the 2 as far as Africa is concerned. And we know from the science that this will result in increased mortality, morbidity, and there'll be increase in infectious diseases. There'll be drying across the continent. The intensity of rainfall will increase, leading to widespread flooding, and we've seen this in the last couple of years across the continent. Sea level rise will harm coastal systems, affecting lives and livelihoods and damaging infrastructure. And we're going to see more increasing weather extremes, and climate extremes, which will expose millions of Africans to acute food insecurity. The increased heat and drought will lead to increased risk to water and energy security. And on the part of ecosystems, we know that ecosystems on the continent have already been degraded due to unsustainable land use practices, natural resource extraction, deforestation, and pollution. And the projections are that there's going to be increase in biodiversity loss, there's going to be increase in degradation, and there'll be damage to both marine and terrestrial ecosystems, which could lead to species extinction and reduction or irreversible loss of ecosystems. So there's going to be a devastating impact, and I think the earlier speaker mentioned this on agriculture, because we rely mostly on rain. So estimates have it that by 2050, maize, sorghum, and millet production will decline on the continent by 22%, 17%, and 15% respectively. In South Africa, for example, it's projected that coarse grains will decline from between 25% to 42%. So the overall effect of this will be a decline in output, decline in growth, increase in poverty, and increase in inequality. One study projects the average GDP losses across the continent could be between 2% and 5% annually. And mind you, this is an average. So the range is from 17% per annum in Cote d'Ivoire to almost 9% in Mozambique and 7% in Kenya. So to get to the second part of your question, really, I want to approach it differently, maybe in a more positive way, and maybe focus on how we can actually address these challenges that build a resilient food system. But before I get into that, let me just also say that African countries are actually very vulnerable. Part of the reason is due to our low adaptive capacity. But the message I want to put across for leaders is that we can apply technological innovations to manage key climate-sensitive sectors, such as agriculture and food systems, ecosystems, and energy. And we will be able to turn around these challenges to make them opportunities. So let me just quickly go through each of these three, starting with agriculture and food systems. So to address climate risks, governments should invest in technological innovations such as climate-smart agriculture. These includes the use of heat and drought-tolerant crop varieties, use of farming techniques such as conservation agriculture, crop diversification, and others, for example, precision agriculture. And in terms of actually addressing issues in the food systems, governments will need to improve smallholder market access by leveraging technology to provide timely market and climate information, to provide access to credits and affordable insurance services. We can also invest in post-harvest management, such as warehouses and cold storage, to improve profit margins for SMEs along the agricultural supply chain. More importantly, we need to ramp up infrastructure development, especially in the rural areas. So I'm talking about roads, water, power, internet connectivity, and we need to strengthen research and extension systems. And finally, there's a need to address the huge gender disparities in agriculture with respect to access to inputs, credit, extension services, and land. And on ecosystems, I see opportunities that can deliver both adaptation and mitigation benefits. So for example, at a carbon price of $50 per ton, 308 metric tons of carbon equivalent can be removed from the atmosphere. And this could create about 86 million jobs in Africa. This is actually very conservative because we are talking about direct jobs, and the estimate does not include indirect jobs. Now, in the energy transition, we need to diversify our energy sources, and I think this has been said, but more importantly, these are sources that can be decentralized, and there's a need to implement demand-side management measures such as battery storage and energy efficiency. The key issue here is energy access. we have 57% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to electricity or clean cooking solutions. So to address this huge energy access gap, countries should be allowed to access finance to develop their natural gas resources as a transition fuel. And in the meantime, they should pursue, of course, renewable energy development. But what I'm saying is that in the interim, I think we need to address the energy access issue. Now, the key to implementing all these adaptation and mitigation strategies is finance. But we know that one of the key constraints that Africa faces really is attracting adequate finance. Actually, Africa receives less than 4% of global climate finance. And countries face various challenges in accessing finance, including lack of technical expertise, lack of data, requirements for funders for co-financing, and also lack of flexibility in the application process. So the whole architecture of global finance needs to be reformed. And I think these are issues that should be taken up at COP27 and beyond. So over to you, Debussy.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Dr. Ajayi. So now that you've touched on quite a few priorities African countries, or at least the African parties to the Conference of Parties should look at, even as we go into Sharm el-Sheikh and beyond. From your perspective, and for someone who's been following the climate negotiations for quite a few years now, where do you see us making the most, or where have you seen us making the most progress? Because now we're moving into the era of being pragmatic. Where have we made the most progress, and where do you think we need to sort of redouble our efforts? Maybe because we don't have enough momentum and where do we think, there's already maturity and other aspects can move on their own engine, on their own steam? Over to you.
Yes, so one of the areas that I believe we've made progress is trying to speak with one voice. And I could see this happened at COP26, where for the first time, we had Africa being united and making a strong case, where the African group of negotiators made a strong case for increased climate finance. We know that the promised $100 billion per year that was promised in COP21 in 2009 Copenhagen has not materialized. But I think for the first time, we've been able to articulate our needs, and we do have estimates of how much our needs are. So the AGM, for example, is targeting $1.3 trillion, something that will help us address adaptation, mitigation, and even cover aspects of loss and damage. So I think that's very positive. We need to continue along that line in COP27, and we need to articulate our case. One area which is going to be a little bit sticky is the issue of stranded assets and even development of gas as a transition fuel, because as you know, the US and the EU have come out and said that they're not going to give any public funds for fossil fuel extraction anywhere in the world, and that's quite understood. But if you look at where Africa is coming from in terms of the low level of access to basic electricity and cooking facilities, which, by the way, is actually adding to the deforestation problem, since we rely mostly on biomass for household thermal energy. This is something which needs to, and especially looking at what has happened with the Russia and Ukraine war, where now some of the advanced countries are actually ramping up production of fossil fuels to address the shortages that we see from Russia. And again, I know that every country has to look after their own interests, but I think this actually strengthens Africa's case that we should be allowed at least, and of course allowed to be able to exploit gas to address the issues. And we are facing challenges. Many African countries have now suffered credit downgrades, which makes it very difficult for them to access capital on the capital market to even develop renewable energy resources. So here, I think we need to make a strong case that we need to be given access to cheaper credits, and also we need to be able to source the technology and the capacity building that we need to develop renewable energy resources. And you can see that African countries have shown serious ambition. If you look at the NDCs that have been submitted, almost everyone is committed to cutting emissions. But we need to do it in such a way that nobody is left behind in the energy transition. So back to you, Debussy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jai. So a just energy transition, and we also we're making a call for African partners to come together to demand and strengthen their hands in their demands for a just energy transition. And it's good to see that you've noted that we have made significant progress in speaking with one voice. And that is important, because to get number one, you really need the number two. So the two go hand in hand. Thank you very much, Dr. Jai.
You're welcome.
Of course, I then muted myself. I want to switch gears here and ask Mr. Faustin Boningoma, the coordinator, Rwandan Climate Change and Development Network, about national strategies and advocacy. Now, do we have what we need to strengthen and amplify our voices from an advocacy perspective? The data, I think we're clear on strong data, compelling data on why we need the demands that have been mentioned by your colleagues on this panel. But do we have any additional, do we have any gaps in what we need to strengthen our hand for advocacy? And how can we improve the advocacy mechanisms and advocacy frameworks for demanding Africa's voice is heard, but also that African partners and African parties can influence the outcomes of whatever document comes out of Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I think one critical issue that we have as Africans is trying to talk from the same voice, understanding issues at the same level. And I think that's one of the major problems that we really have as Africans. Going back to and starting from where Alex Murisa talked about capacity building and when we shall be able to drive our agenda, we are in a day and a time when the private sector is actually driving all agendas. The multinational companies are the ones that actually drive the COP agendas because they drive their countries' negotiations. Quite unfortunately, our private sectors in the South, in the global South, seem to be hinged in the global North. And as a result, it's not the private sector that is driving discussions, but our governments as parties. And what does that one call for? It calls, first of all, to invigorate ourselves and understand who we are as Africans and what we want. You can see, if I can see the number of doctors on this panel and the number of doctors in Africa and the issue of capacity building that comes over and over again, claiming that we do not have capacity, we need to start asking ourselves why we claim not to be having capacity all the time. And at the end of the day, what we are given is what we take. Sometimes people who come to build our capacities are those who do not even have capacity themselves. That's why the technological transfer has been a problem. Today in Africa, we are talking about hunger. Agriculture policies have been in place for decades. What have they changed? But hardly would we realize that we are not growing our own homegrown solutions that can give us response. It's time that we need to transition to agroecology, drawing on indigenous knowledge, innovating with science, providing diverse cultural appropriate diets, and embedded in communities, empowering Africans to solve the problem of hunger. If we go short of that, we shall continue cycling around industrial agriculture that will not give us response. I have heard one of my colleagues talk about climate smart agriculture. What is embedded in climate smart agriculture? And how climate smart is it? Sometimes, and more, science shows that actually the climate smart agriculture that is being talked about is part of industrial forms of agriculture, which at the end of the day increases the greenhouse gas emissions. Instead of using our local systems, we go to get solutions that will not respond to what can be responded to in order to ensure that hunger is dealt with. We are talking about these issues when actually, when you look at the present circumstances of issues that are happening in the Horn of Africa, the droughts that have persisted for a long time, the floods in the south, you get to find that the hunger will persistently continue if we don't get solutions to how we can deal with them. Now, nationally, we are talking about this, and we are talking with government. Transition, go back to the systems that can enable the soils to become healthy, biodiversity, ability to absorb carbon in form of the agriculture that we are practicing. And I think it's time that we need to come down on the drawing board and ask ourselves as Africans, where did we go wrong? What are we achieving with this green revolution? What did India achieve out of it, the ones who went before us? Why is it that they are now coming back into the traditional forms that they were using before? We need to ask ourselves why we went wrong. Come back to the drawing board and say, what type of food are we producing? And actually, to go a little bit beyond that, we need to ask ourselves the food that we lose in terms of post-harvest harvest. Those are the kind of things we should be asking ourselves. And I think it's very important to go to COP27, taking this idea of agroecology and requesting for its recognition within the negotiation rooms. Also looking at the way climate finance for sustainable agriculture can be enhanced so that we can get resources that are required to deal with the adverse effects of climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fasan. And you know, last year in Glasgow, we had a situation where an alternate COP26 was organized, and it was called the People Summit. Hopefully, we hope to see in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh a more inclusive platform where all voices are included and all voices are in a single room, and we are not divided in our congregations. So, as you've just touching on the points that you've mentioned here, the points that need to be on the negotiating table, agroecology, sustainable finance, all approaches are necessary. Of course, we know climate smart technologies, different technologies that ensure that agriculture can thrive in the face of an evolving climate scenario. Every technology can be climate smart everywhere, but all technologies can't be climate smart in a single place. So climate smart technologies or climate smart agriculture are practices that are contextual depending on location and situations. Now, my follow-up question to you is, what gets you excited about the mechanisms for providing a voice for advocacy groups? Do we have strong mechanisms for your voices to be heard in the lead up to Sharm el-Sheikh and beyond? Do you feel confident that your voices are being heard amongst, as of course, a valid party to the COP meetings? Over to you.
Thank you so much. One of the things that we are doing is to ensure that our voice nationally goes to the levels where we engage at continental level. We are engaging through our Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. It's a Pan-African continental civil society. Also through the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, we've been engaging the African group of negotiators to ensure that our demands and our concerns are taken to the negotiating tables. But we are also negotiating with our governments to see if they could accredit us as part of the negotiating team at national level, so that our ideas could also penetrate into the negotiating room and be considered. That said, we've been very vocal in terms of ensuring that the issues of loss and damage are well discussed at continental level. We've also been making sure that the principle that was discarded, the common but differentiated principle that was discarded, should again be brought back into the discussions, because we're asking ourselves, how does a continent emit 3.8 to 4% and yet be considered like the others who are emitting even 40% of the emissions? You see, that's not climate justice. Justice will only be met if people realize that the greater emitters should actually pay for their emissions, so that we are able to get finances to build the resilience of our communities. Otherwise, the moment this element of common but differentiated gets out, and we completely leave it out and we don't fight for its coming back, then that's one of the reasons as to why the promises that are given on finances are never met. Because this time, even in our countries, what we are saying, giving an example of Rwanda today, it's unfortunate that possibly Minister has left. Rwanda has ambitious NDCs that targeted reducing the emissions by 38%. Reducing the emissions by 38% means that of the required 11 million for both adaptation and mitigation, 5.7 billion is on mitigation. When you look at what Rwanda emits, we need to commit such amount so that we really can build our communities resilience. Are we supposed to be much leaning on mitigation than leaning on adaptation, when actually our people are facing disastrous effects of climate change and therefore need to build their resilience so that they can adapt to the climate change? Those are the kind of discussions we are talking about. So we are discussing with our own governments, we are discussing with the African group of negotiators, we are engaging at continental level with other climate change activists and advocates, so that we have a common voice that can actually see Africa being taken to another level in terms of negotiations, in terms of discussing the finances, discussing loss and damage, but ensuring that adaptation is brought to the fore beyond any other kind of discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Bringing the attention back to adaptation and ensuring that this becomes a priority for African parties to the COP meetings in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you very much for all the work that you're doing, and I now want to open the floor to our attentive members of the audience. Thank you very much for joining the conversation. I've been following the questions that are in the Q&A. I invite you to please use the Q&A function to type in your questions. And I will read these out now to our august panelists. And I invite the panelists to indicate by whether raising your hand if you wish to take the question. First question is from an anonymous attendee. The agriculture development discourse in Africa often speaks about the need to raise productivity to meet food security needs. At the same time, the climate discourse demands more diversity in agriculture systems. Now, are these demands compatible? Is it possible to increase productivity and improve efficiency while raising farm level diversity as well? That's a complicated question. I think that's something meaty enough for our brilliant panelists to tackle. And I'm looking for a show of hands for who would like to tackle this question. Otherwise, we can break it into parts and then have others. Okay, I see Dr. Ajayi. Dr. Ajayi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Debisi. I should say this is a weighty question, so I'm not sure I can address it fully in just a few seconds. But the key question is it possible to increase productivity and at the same time maintain diversity and efficiency? And my question is, why not? This can be done. First of all, you have to look at where we are coming from. We are coming from a very low base. African agricultural productivity is very low. It ranks lower than all the regions. And this is purely due to the use of minimal inputs, such as hoe and cutlass, and the lack of more improved varieties. And improving primary inputs, improving the varieties, having climate tolerant, drought tolerant varieties, which are often more expensive for farmers, could easily increase the productivity of farmers. And I think that's the first thing we need to do to raise the level of productivity. I do admit that the type of agriculture also often has a negative impact on the environment. And that's why climate smart agriculture includes techniques such as conservation agriculture, which uses minimal inputs and which tries as much as possible not to disrupt the soil, and also the use of varieties which do not require as much water, for example. Those are the drought tolerant ones. So just these simple things which Africa can invest in could easily lift and have a win-win situation. So my answer to that question is that it's possible to do that using the right kinds of agricultural practices. Back to you, Debisi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajayi. I think that's a brilliant response to it. I would add maybe just another caveat to that question is, in addition to, is it possible to increase productivity while raising farm level diversity, is can we then make the output globally competitive? Because it's not just about productivity and increasing diversity. You also have to be competitive. Agriculture is a business. So if you have farm level diversity high and you increase productivity, but it's at the cost that now makes it non-competitive, then you have a different set of challenge to contend with. So these are should we call them the wicked problems that we contend with on a daily basis in global agriculture. So there are no easy answers to this, and these are real questions and valid questions that will continue to be tackled by scientists and development partners and professionals and entrepreneurs, not just in Africa but around the world. And thank you very much for that question. The next question I want to bring up, this is related to the just energy transition that was discussed earlier. It says, evidence has shown that exploitation of natural gas does not guarantee energy access. Many fossil fuel rich countries across the continent also have low levels of access. Surely this cannot be justification for exploiting fossil fuels that will shoot up global greenhouse gas emissions, making global warming worse and making Africa more vulnerable to increasing climate risks. So this is a question around the just energy transition. How valid can we say is is the right of African countries to grow or industrialize using fossil fuels as a base, even if they are discussing this within the context of a transition? Should we just switch immediately to renewables? And what are the implications of that? Dr. Ajayi, your hand is still up. I'm not sure if you want to tackle this as well, or this is a legacy hand up.
No,
okay.
No. So this is a new hand because I want to take a shot at this question.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a fair question, but the starting point for me, and I do agree that energy access, even from gas, it could be low, because currently most of the gas on the continent is exported to Western countries, and this is probably going to increase in the coming months, due to the war in Ukraine. In my own country, Ghana, we do have gas, but the utilization is very low. And for Ghana, as well as a lot of African countries, this is because the infrastructure to distribute the gas does not exist. Because we just found gas about 11 years ago, and so the infrastructure for exploiting gas, it does not exist. In the interim, whilst we are trying to implement renewable energy policies, and this is not going to happen overnight, we're not going to transition to low carbon overnight. We still need to address the energy access problem. If African governments could get low funds to develop gas infrastructure, and Nigeria, for example, until recently was flaring its gas possibly because the infrastructure does not exist. We could address the electricity access problem if we had funds to do that. And let me just finish by saying that even if Africa were to triple its use of natural gas, it will still contribute less than 1% of global carbon emissions. So I think this is a fair trade-off to make. So back to you, Debisi.
Thank you, Dr. Ajayi. I like that, a fair trade-off. It's a trade-off. I don't think there are any easy answers here or any binary answers. Dr. Madzivandila, I know I will be bringing you on for closing remarks after this Q&A, but I wanted to invite you to respond to one question that we have here, and the question is, what can anyone on the panel speak to initiatives and measures to improve inclusion for focusing on youth in climate initiatives? How can adaptation or mitigation initiatives mainstream youth inclusion? Do you care to share some of your thoughts on that? Shalizi? There we go. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Moderator, I stepped out a bit. That's why when I came back, I mistakenly then punched my my camera. But if you can repeat the question, then I will.
Oh, sure. It's a straightforward question. What was, so from your position with Panera, what are you doing to include youth in adaptation and mitigation? How do you ensure that we improve the youth inclusion in this process?
Yes. Oh, yes. So to answer to your question, which then it was part of my closing remarks, then I do believe that the double benefits of adaptation and mitigation are important. But for Africa, the focus in the past recent years has been more on adaptation. So the value proposition that as FANAP and we bring forward is when we convene our platforms, then we are about accepting all the voices that are coming forth, and also with equal standing. So we know that the value chain has got different components or stages, and then youth have got different interests in those stages. So the question is, how then do we bring in a value proposition that is appealing for them to engage in the stage in which they feel they're most appropriate to engage? What we do as FANAPAN is to provide the platform. And when I go to my closing remarks, then I will articulate in terms of how then do we bring about a co-creation within a platform.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one question here from an anonymous attendee in French. So you will forgive my poor French to English translation. It talks about innovations. It's good to use innovations and other research to improve climate resilience. How do we ensure that the farmers get the right solutions to address climate change? What's the state of agriculture extension in taking the science to the farmers? I believe that was the question. And also, how do we ensure that the farmers get their voices and perceptions on climate change to the right audience? Who would like to tackle this? I see we have no takers. Mr. Jai, would you mind me summoning you again?
Yes. Could you repeat the question? I mean,
sure.
I wasn't very sure.
So it's a two-part question. The first is, how do we ensure that the farmers we get the voices of farmers to decision makers on climate change? And the second thing is, how do we connect the knowledge and the technologies to farmers? How do we put technologies in the hands of farmers? What are the mechanisms for getting this done?
Yeah. Okay. So the first one, it's a very valid question, and that's because often when we talk about climate change, it's often at a very high level, and the voices of farmers, young people, women are missing. So that's something that here at ASET we've picked on, and for this COP, we are actually organizing to have voices of young people, most of them in agriculture, and we have some engagements in the next few weeks whereby we're going to meet these young farmers, and we're planning then to have we're planning some events at COP where their voices will be heard. So it's a very good question, and especially the smallholder farmers' voices have been lost in the debate, and their inputs to the climate change debate have been missing. Even things like indigenous knowledge about climate change have not been utilized across the continent. So I think that now is the right time to do that. Of course, there are only a few weeks left to COP27, but even looking at beyond COP27, I think this is something that think tanks and civil society organizations should be working on to try to get the voices of farmers heard. Now, the second part of the question is also a very good question, in the sense that how do you put the technology in the hands of farmers? There are many challenges in this area, and a lot of them has to do with government policy, and so this is something that governments have to invest in. First of all, there's a technology, but the technology is not adopted if the poor farmer doesn't even see the need for it. So there's that education and awareness through extension services and through other means to make them aware of the technology. To get it in the hands of farmers, it has to be appropriate technology. So we cannot import something from the UK and expect that it's going to work somewhere in the village in Ghana. So it does need modification to local conditions, and this requires effort, it requires funding, and this is something that governments can work on to make sure that technology gets into the hands of our smallholder farmers. So back to you, WC.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Jai. I want to take the last question, but I will respond to that. And this is from Rashid Siraj in Morocco. from the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, and it goes, one of the key outcomes of COP22 in Marrakesh was the AAA initiative, the adaptation of African agriculture. The momentum seems to be still alive at the policy level. Is there a scope to put this on the table in Sharm el-Sheikh? Rashid, I believe we thank the government of Morocco for their leadership on the AAA initiative. The AAA initiative, to my knowledge, is still strong, going on strong, and will continue to influence outcomes, even as we go into COP27 and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for engaging in following the discussion, but also for your thoughtful and nuanced questions. We are not running out of time, but we do have to move on to the next segment of this session now, and I would like to invite Dr. Shilidzi Madi Vandela, the CEO and head of mission, Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network, FANRAPAN, to provide us with the closing remarks. Dr. Madi Vandela.
Thank you so much, Moderator Dr. Araba, for the opportunity. I thank you so much. This has been a very interesting discussion, and by its own nature, very charged, and also bringing out some very good insights. But for me, as we prepare for the COP27 happening in Egypt in a few weeks' time, a most fitting proverb comes to mind. And I believe that our forefathers knew the value and power of collaborative process. And when they said that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together with others. And then in this vein, I just want to acknowledge AKADEMIYA2063 for the convening of this important platform. They didn't convene it alone, but with some partners. And this is definitely a journey that will go a long way. And also I believe that it's gonna be bringing quality when we go to COP27. Ladies and gentlemen, I just came out of the 3-day FANAPAN annual high-level regional dialogue, and we're debating about the same issues. And the theme there was resilient African food systems, solution for climate change, livelihood, food and nutrition security. And similarly, our theme here today is about food systems and climate change, assessing readiness, policy lessons in global negotiations. The wording is different here, but what I'm seeing is that the issues are very the same. And given these similarities, then I believe that as policy think tanks, as research organizations, we are converging in terms of the content. And by the content, I mean the what, which is more about the subject matter, which we always discuss when we convene. And I believe that the challenges, opportunities, and the lessons learned, and the mechanism in terms of the approach, how can we do things better? Then we are trying to make sure that we are building a case and we are finding each other. But my assertion here today is that as much as the content or the subject matter in terms of challenges and opportunities, we are agreeing on that, but my assertion is about how then do we define the process? Because we have been hearing that the progress is sporadic in nature. We are moving in a very slow pace, but then how can we ramp up the way we are doing things? And I want to focus my remarks on the how. And when the question about youth then came up, then in part, then I'll attend to that. The way we need to approach our marching orders to COP27 is that we do not need to leave one behind. And then the question is, how then do we build a common voice or common voices for Africa? Because this is touted as a COP for Africa and for Africans. So I want to leave you with 3 things. We need to think through how are we crafting our message. Number 2, we need to think through how then do we convene our platform to make sure that we are building the consensus. And 3, we need to be thinking about who are our champions. We know that negotiators are there, but who are other messengers that we can use? If I can elaborate a bit in terms of the message. The co-creation issue from the research side, we know they're doing that, but we can do it better. We have been hearing that the evidence that we need to be bringing to the platforms need to be science-based. But my contribution also is that we need to bring the practice side, which is bringing forth the lived experiences, building the evidence bottom up. Coming to the platforms, us as policy think tanks, then we always think that we are multi-stakeholder in nature, but more often we only bring our friends and those that are agreeing to our agenda. How then do we diversify the people that we bring to our platform? Also then, how then do we make that those platforms are safe spaces for people to dialogue? And also then we know that then we are legitimate institutions to convene, but who do we make sure that we are communicating to? The messages that are coming from our platforms. Example, this one and the one that we also had as FANAPA. In terms of the messengers or the champions, we know that the negotiators are there. How then are we packaging them using the evidence that we generated? And also then, how then do we equip them to communicate and use the non-conventional ways to communicate? These are the things that I think we really need to think through on how best then do we deliver our message at the COP27. The issues have been raised here, and then I had a long list in terms of the COP17 then brought a bit of hope. COP21 also then buttressed that hope by also making sure that the agriculture issues are brought forward. COP26 then brought the financing mechanisms. But what I am saying here is that noting that the progress is slow, how can we catalyze meaningful change diligently and faster to deal with the complex issue that we are dealing with, which is interconnected? The complex issues here are climate change and malnutrition. We know as Africa, we are not doing good in those. How then do we deal with these wicked challenges which are pervasive in nature? So in conclusion, my humble request is that given the momentum that we have harnessed during the UNFSS dialogues in 2021, where we were aligning ourselves to make sure that we've got one Africa voice, how can we do it for this COP, which is meant for Africans? So my plea is that the coming dialogues, which AKADEMIYA2063 gonna be convening, FANAPA gonna be convening, let's go in that in collaboration and in partnership. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Wonderful, inspiring words. Thank you very much, Dr. Mazin Bandila. At this point, I would like to thank all our speakers, Alex Mulisa from Rwanda, Dr. John Asafo Ajayi, Ms. Bibi Giose, Mr. Fostan Wilingoma, of course, Dr. Mazin Bandila, and finally, my dear brother and Oga, Dr. Usman Badian, the Executive Chairperson of AKADEMIYA2063. Thank you very much to our audience, attentive audience. Thank you very much for the engagement in the chat. Thank you for the questions. And I would now like to hand the mic to Dr. Lai Butake to give the closing remarks. Dr. Butake.
Thank you so much, Dr. Araba. Thank you for accepting to moderate this conversation. I promised you that it was going to be nothing short of rich and exciting, and I'm glad that our panelists lived up to our expectations. Please drop a message in the chat, drop one word to let us know how you found this conversation, what it represents to you and what you learned. There's so many takeaways, so many questions, but also so many solutions. How do we move from policy design to implementation, to monitoring and evaluation? How do we mainstream climate action across various sectors to address food insecurity? How do we address the gender gap, as mentioned by Ms. Giose? And the takeaways that kept coming back from the various panelists was about having a common understanding of the issues, having a common position, having common messaging, common communications, investing in capacity building, and of course, collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an exciting first session of the Academia 2063 Climate Policy Dialogue Series. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for staying to the end. Thank you to all our speakers and especially to our moderator, Dr. Araba. Please stay tuned for more details on the next two sessions. I will be sharing the information. Kindly click the link in the chat to subscribe to our newsletter and stay abreast with all our events and knowledge products. You can visit academia2063.org to visit our website and see what we're doing. And we hope you will come back next time and bring a friend. Thank you so much for joining us and have an excellent rest of the day. See you next time.